Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the International Peace Institute. I'm Francesco Mancini, Senior Director of Research at IPI, and I welcome you to the seminar on regional cooperation for civilian capacity development after conflict. Now, as you all know well, the rebuilding of public administrations and the strengthening of national institutions are important steps in the recovery process. Effective administrations are critical for peace building, for state-society relations, and establishing the social contract, for economic development, and most important for achieving resilience and preventing relapse into conflict. Today, visitors from Afghanistan and South Sudan and our partners from NUPI and the IIS will present lessons from two innovative capacity development projects. These projects offer important insights on regional cooperation and triangular and South-South partnerships. And as potential models, these projects point us toward the future of civilian capacity development, revealing the promise of peer-to-peer learning, mentoring, and twinning projects, while also pointing to challenging areas that need attention from the international level to the more local management level of these projects. Now, I just want to thank our partners for bringing this initiative to us, the Danish Institute for International Studies, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center, or as they are commonly known, the IIS, NUPI, and NOREF. On behalf of us all, I also would like to express our gratitude to Sarah Cliff, Ambassador Francis Deng, Ambassador Ardeep Puri, and Ambassador Tahir Tanin, who will join us for the second session, for joining us today and contributing to this gathering. And of course, a special thanks goes to Anjef Dedut, and who's coming here from South Sudan, and Sophia Dahia, who is coming from Afghanistan, for sharing your unique insider views. Two technical points. First of all, the first session of this seminar will be broadcast live. We will turn off the cameras at the break at 11 for a more off-the-record conversation during the second session. And second technical element, these microphones work very well, but you have to turn it on first and move them quite close to your mouth. Okay, so thank you very much for this. I now pass the floor to Cedric Deconi, who's the head of Peace Operation and Peace Building at NUPI, and then we move to our opening remarks. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and I don't want to repeat all the acknowledgements and thank yous, but just to say that we are delighted to be here at IPI and in New York with all our different partners and stakeholders in this project. We are really excited today to focus on this very innovative approach to capacity development in fragile states. And I think there's two things that I hope we're going to get out of this meeting today. The first is that there has been this assumption in the whole civilian capacity initiative that people with the same cultural affinity, people from the same region, should have a better approach with colleagues in fragile states, and therefore this focus on South-South cooperation. And what we're dealing with here today are two very interesting examples of South-South, in fact, North cooperation or triangular cooperation agreements or arrangements, where we have countries from the region contributing to the capacity development, aligned with donors and multilateral organizations and so forth. So we really look forward to unpacking what works, what doesn't work, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities that come with this unique alignment of partners. And the second aspect is our involvement as a research institutions in this work and how accompanying this process quite early on. In other words, this is not a kind of a post facto research or evaluation. This is an accompaniment kind of a research walking along the path as this process is being developed. We're very interested to see also how research in the sense contributes here as a kind of a peace-building programming action to this development in this process. So I hope those are two of the things that we will really get out of our time here together. So thank you very much, and we look forward to the day together. And I think we'll hand now to our two opening speakers. First, Assistant Secretary General Sarah Cliff.
Thank you very much, Francisco and Cedric. And thank you to NUPI, to NORAD, and to DIIS for having convened this ceremony, this seminar rather, and greetings to our visitors from South Sudan. I think I met the Undersecretary General almost 2 years ago when I was there, so it's very good to see you here with this program already very much underway. I wanted to focus first on the importance of this topic. I think that it's very easy for us in New York to become very bound up with the immediate and urgent security and humanitarian crises. And we saw, for instance, in the high-level segment of the GA, that for very obvious reasons, the situation in Syria dominated many of those discussions, along with other urgent crises worldwide. But it's important in our focus on that not to lose attention on the many situations in which urgent capacity building assistance is needed. And most importantly, if national institutions are not strengthened, it will be difficult for the countries concerned to find a really sustainable exit from crisis. We know that the strength of national institutions is the key factor in making sure that recovery from conflict can be sustainable. 30 to 45% greater risk of relapse into conflict where national institutions are not strengthened. And when we look around the world today, the situations where there has been a success in restoring immediate peace, but the situation of national institutions is still challenging, are quite widespread. I was actually just taking stock of this over the last couple of weeks and was surprised by the number of UN missions, for instance, which are now in that situation. So we have long-standing missions in South Sudan, of course, in Afghanistan, in Côte d'Ivoire, in DRC, in Haiti, in Liberia, in Libya, just to give some of the examples. We have new missions in Somalia and in Mali coming up. And in all of those situations, the imperative to support governments in building the capacity of their national institutions has been a key part of the establishment of the missions and the setting up of their mandate. So the subject of the seminar today, I really think, is crucially important for the success of those different situations around the world, to support the government's recovery plans, and also to make sure that the investment that has been made by the UN and its member states is actually sustained and successful in the long term. The seminar also focuses very strongly, as Francisco and Cedric said, on South-South, North-South triangular cooperation. We've been doing some work recently in the Civilian Capacities Initiative on what are some of the differences between northern models of assistance for institution building and southern models. And there are some key differences. So here I'm going to caricature a little, but essentially most assistance coming from OECD countries for capacity building is designed by development agencies, but delivered primarily through specialized consultants and contractors. It's often combined with cash-based assistance, sometimes for budget support, sometimes for equipment or facilities. A great deal of the assistance from southern partners is equally agreed and designed by the specialized entities of foreign ministries or development agencies, but delivered primarily through their own domestic sector ministries, sometimes through local or provincial agencies. And looking at that, there are great strengths of both models. The sector solidarity approach of bringing people directly from government ministries, I think we are seeing has huge strengths in the relevance of experience. Very often these are people who have gone through, in their own ministries at home, programs of capacity building or institutional reform, which are directly relevant to the situations that they're going into. And it also has advantages in the speed and adaptability of assistance. We know that coming from the multilateral system or looking from a perspective of OECD donors, that we have now set up processes which sometimes mean that actual deployments of assistance or the start of program activities take a long time. And the difficulty in post-conflict or crisis situations is that governments really need rapid assistance if they're going to restore confidence. There are also advantages in the ability of these programs to adapt. And I think it's one of the things we'll see from the cases today, that the approaches taken have often been quite flexible to try to help national counterparts with the problems that they're facing, rather than having a very rigid, predetermined approach to what sort of results should be developed. There are still great complementary strengths from the history in OECD countries of providing institution building assistance. In particular here, the links with long-term sustainable results and with other instruments like budget support or investment programs, which can provide complementary inputs. Because after all, simply providing the ability to do skills transfer, if that's not sustained by civil servants having their salaries paid or working in facilities which are operable, doesn't necessarily deliver results. So what I think is very interesting about the two examples that we're looking at today is that as triangular cooperation, in both cases supported by the UN system, they have brought together some of the complementary strengths of those approaches. So being able to look at bringing very relevant skills, who perhaps have an easier time in working with their national counterparts. I'll be very interested to hear some of the more recent lessons on that side. But also trying to make sure that those deployments and the skills transfer involved are embedded in a larger program of dialogue and capacity building. In terms of questions for the future that I hope that the seminar might be able to address, first is whether this is really a model of assistance which merits scaling up. It's interesting to me that although the UN has had a long-term emphasis on South-South cooperation, this has relatively little been applied in post-conflict situations or on peace-building themes. And yet those are areas, in fact, where one could argue this has a particular comparative advantage given the type of experience that's needed. And second, what lessons would we draw from this experience in terms of practical actions that could be used to strengthen this type of program in future? And here I think we've been very lucky to have the support of the institutions involved in organizing this seminar to do a kind of active learning research. So our normal habit is to wait until programs are absolutely finished and 5 years later do a very comprehensive evaluation. But that's often a bit too late to inform the design of the ongoing programs. So this, I think, is a great approach, and the partnership in terms of providing some real-time input is very useful. Many thanks and welcome to the seminar.
I now pass the floor to Ambassador Francis Deng, Permanent Representative of South Sudan to the United Nations. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really don't have much to say other than express my deep appreciation for the co-sponsors, both of this seminar and of the project in general. As Sarah Cliff was indicating, in a world where there are such competing concerns, it is particularly gratifying that South Sudan is being focused upon, and I think rightly so, because here is a country which, frankly, was neglected even during the colonial days, completely neglected, and then suffered half a century of war, so that when people talk of reconstruction, Southerners generally would say, we're talking about construction from nothing. I came across this project when I was visiting Juba, and in fact heard a country lady here, the dude, make a very, very impressive presentation of the project, and a number of the people who were involved from the neighboring countries participated. My initial concern was that there would be what the documents here, what the reports refer to as a reaction to what Southerners would consider like stealing jobs. To me, it is that, but it is more than that. It is Southerners probably feeling, why are they bringing these foreigners? Don't we have people here? And when I say there was nothing at all, I should qualify that by saying that at the same time that the war was going on, Southerners were educating themselves. And more than most African countries when they became independent, you find that Southerners have a good number of reasonably well-educated people. My problem with them is their education is not oriented to the needs of the country. And so it's a question of really how you make use of these by reorienting them to be relevant to what is happening. And this is where, again, twinning comes in. I was also slightly sort of ambivalent about the use of the word coaching and mentoring as to how people would feel about that. But the reports do say that twinning is, in fact, more preferred by those involved than, I should say, though, that I never sensed any negative reaction on the part of the Southerners who were there and who participated in this program, much of which was simply appreciation. Nor did I see any sense of arrogance on the part of the neighbors who were participating in the South. On the contrary, I saw a great deal of sensitivity to avoid hurting others. Of course, I have also had the advantage of talking to Sarah Cliff a number of times and about the project. And I have wondered whether the idea of focusing on the region and this cultural affinity concept can be expanded so that the pool is larger. In other words, it may well be that there are countries farther removed that could have comparative advantage in being involved in this. I can see the value of working with those who share pretty much the experiences of the same sub-region, but I think the idea itself can expand. And in fact, I sometimes wonder whether focusing so much on cultural affinity addresses all the challenges we face, because cross-cultural fertilization or cooperation or traction also has its place. And I think it's ultimately a question of how one balances the pluses and minuses of all of that. I realize that the other one, consultancies from developed countries, tend to be very expensive and very challenging, and probably one of the reasons why this arrangement is much more preferable. I should say, though, that the countries that are contributing these from the neighborhood have been very, very helpful to the South. It was they who took the initiative, the peace initiative, that later on was reinforced by what became the Friends of IGAD and ultimately partners. And although the process was long and eventually involved others, credit goes to them that had it not been for IGAD, which had the innovative way of looking at conflicts in Africa by telling the Sudan, look, if you want us to help you, we will help you, but we have to address the real problems of your country. And the problems are that South Sudan was never a participant in your self-determination that brought independence. So we would advocate the South having self-determination. We would favor unity, but you would have to create conditions that would make unity attractive. Failing that, we should be prepared to accept the independence of the South. So from the peace process to what they are now doing through this project, I think the countries of the neighborhood have done a lot. Norway, among others, of course, has been very, very helpful. And I see in this trilateral relationship, their contribution is critically important. I don't know whether it will remain single Norway or whether the potentials for expanding are there. But as I told Sarah before, I'm here really to learn more about the project. I don't have much to add, and so I'll pass it on to those who have much more substance to contribute. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Excellent. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. I would now pass the floor to Ambassador Ardip Puri to chair the first session and to present the cases. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco. After a very full and comprehensive opening session, I think we can go straight into these innovative projects in South Sudan and Afghanistan. And we are very fortunate to have two distinguished speakers with hands-on experience of running these projects in South Sudan and Afghanistan. So may I request you, Madam Undersecretary, to kick off with your presentation.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the people present here representing the various institutions as well as countries who are interested in this initiative of South-South cooperation. I feel honored to be here today and share my experience of managing the RSS IGAD initiative, which has received a lot of attention across different forums. It has been my pleasure to receive and explain the initiative to quite a number of senior people, Sarah Cliff among them, and to explain how we have been managing the program over the past 2 years. But before I go into it, I think it's good for me to also thank the key donor, the government of Norway, because they invested over 18 million taxpayers' money towards phase 1 of the IGAD project. This is a little known initiative, but the fact that they put so much money into it shows their trust in the success of the outcome of the initiative. Our civil service as a country has had a lot of ups and downs. We've been through a number of conflicts over the past few decades, and the civil administration within the country is basically representative of former soldiers who are part of the civil service. We have the Civilian Authority of the New Sudan, which was operating in the liberated areas, and then we have the South Sudan Coordination Council, which was operating in the old Sudan, but was the one running the administration in South Sudan. So it was basically a service that was set up of people who were willing to serve in the hard conditions that existed in South Sudan. Initially, when you look at our civil service, it was structured in a manner which leaves a lot to be desired. It wasn't really based on who has the right skills to contribute, but more who was there at the time they were setting up the government. So these divergent backgrounds led to the government to grow in a very disorganized manner. And in 2008, there was an initiative for a public service reform that was initiated by the government under the leadership of the then Minister of Labor, Public Service and Human Resource Development, Madame Aout. And through this came the IGAD initiative. There was a lot of engagement that started with the neighboring countries, and the State Minister of Public Service in the government of Kenya took the lead together with his counterparts from Ethiopia and Uganda. So it's on the basis of this constant engagement with the neighboring countries who were members of the IGAD that the IGAD initiative came into being. It is a partnership which involves Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and South Sudan as the beneficiary nation. So through the RSS IGAD initiative, civil servants, experienced civil servants, were seconded and placed within our government at different levels of government. That's the central, state, and county level. 80 were from Kenya, 60 from Uganda, and 60 from Ethiopia. They were contracted by our government, which means that when they came into South Sudan, although the program is managed by UNDP, they were basically, sorry, you've gone ahead, sorry. They were basically signing contracts with the government of South Sudan. I was the signatory on behalf of the government, and the civil servants were treated in the same manner that South Sudanese civil servants were treated. They were deployed within the various ministries in the government, and they were to be twinned with civil servants in our government. The concept of twinning here assumes that A civil servant who has been identified within our government is to now have a counterpart from one of the IGAD countries sit with him or her in the same office, and they go through the routine work that they're supposed to do together, so that through the concept of coaching and mentoring, there's a transfer of knowledge to the civil servant for him to be able to carry the work forward once the civil servant from IGAD is no longer there. So the program is wholly funded by the government of Norway, and in phase one, about $18 million have actually been spent for the program. So our ministry is the key ministry overseeing the running of the program, and we have worked with the 3 IGAD countries to help identify the suitable people who are to be brought. Initially, the process goes through a request that we sent out to the various government institutions, asking them to tell us what are the kinds of skills they need their civil servants to be built in. What kind of capacities do they need? So based on the responses we get, we work together with those ministries to develop job descriptions, and then these are forwarded to the 3 member IGAD countries, who are then asked to recruit civil servants from those countries. In the recruitment process, we are also involved because we send a representative who sits on the panels and ensures that the people who are brought in are credible and are vetted properly. To date, we have managed to bring in 199 civil servants. Unfortunately, 1 civil servant died while on holiday in Ethiopia, so the number stays at 199. Out of the 199, they came in different batches. The first phase, we had 46 from Kenya in June 2011. Then we had 93 from Ethiopia and Uganda, followed by 8 in April 2012, and lastly by the last group of 22 in March earlier this year. We have managed to deploy them across the 10 states of South Sudan, and mainly in 22 institutions. There are ministries, as well as the National Legislative Assembly, as well as the Council of States, and then some commissions like the HIV/AIDS in 18 different areas and professions. However, when you look at the statistics, most of them are within the Ministry of Health, and this has raised a lot of questions as to why specifically the Ministry of Health was getting a big number. It happened by default, I would say, because it was a case of the undersecretary of that ministry buying into the concept before his other colleagues in the other ministry. At that time, when the initiative started, there was a lot of negative publicity. People were very hostile, right from the leadership, as to why we were bringing in people from Ethiopia and Uganda and Kenya, while we have civil servants who could have worked. So based on that hostility, some of the ministries did not request initially, but today they are the ones who are asking for more people to be sent to them. So the Undersecretary of Health put in their requests. There was an urgent need for health practitioners, and they were able to get 37% out of the 200 civil service support officers. My ministry comes in second because I believe I bought into the idea also, and being the one supporting it, I put in my request too. On the progress of the project, today, the way we do it is we conduct a one-day orientation program in the respective IGAD countries. Through that one-day program, they're first given some orientation on South Sudan, the kind of reception they will get, their entitlements, and this kind of prepares them for when they now come into South Sudan and go through a 2-week induction program in Juba, where they're given orientation with regards to how the civil service in our country works, on the laws of South Sudan, the culture, key policy documents that they need to know, the history, as well as issues on housing security that will help them slowly adjust to their new lives. After the orientation and induction programs, we felt that there was a need to also train in coaching and mentoring. It's true, they have a lot of experience, but then again, coaching and mentoring is something that you don't just get, but which you need to be trained on. So what we do is the training on coaching and mentoring is given to both the mentor as well as the mentee. We bring them together, take them through the process so that they understand that they're working together. It was mentioned earlier that the concept of coaching and mentoring has not been taken up as quickly as the concept of twinning. The idea is that nobody is superior to the other. They're working at the same level. We have some very senior people who are twinned with others, hence they work as equals and not one being superior to the other. And I think for purposes of transfer of knowledge, it makes sense to go with the concept of twinning rather than having one person become the mentor and the mentee in terms of transfer. So just to take us back, I think it's worthy to look at how the recruitment or deployment process is done. Usually the recruitment is done within the IGAD countries. We are part and parcel of the process. Then we take them through the one-day orientation session, which I mentioned, followed by an induction workshop. Initially it was 1 week, but we have moved it to 2 weeks because often the needs that need to be addressed are much greater than could be covered within 1 week. Followed by the induction session on coaching and mentoring for both their twins as well as the CSSOs, and finally deployment to their respective ministries. We have managed to achieve a lot over the past 2 years. We have conducted 3 civil service support officers review workshops. One was in July, followed by February, and then July again earlier this year. We have developed and administered an individual appraisal tool, which we use for assessing the civil service support officers. What we did was we tried to look around. As a government, we don't have an appraisal tool on performance as yet. So we tried to talk with our colleagues from the 3 countries in public service to see what they have in their countries. And based on that, we developed one that we felt was ideal for the CSSOs on the basis of which they would be assessed. And the final assessment is also shared with their countries. The reason we felt that we need to share it with their countries is because as they work with us, their countries are still paying their salaries. They're also being considered for promotion and other entitlements. So they feel that they need to know if their civil servants are performing, then it would justify promoting them or giving them additional incentive at the end of their service in South Sudan. We again conducted a midterm performance assessment of the project. This was from May to July 2012, and this helped to inform the design of phase 2. I'm happy to report that based on the successes of the project, the government of Norway has agreed to fund phase 2 for the RSS IGAD project with 200 additional civil service support officers. Also, additionally, there was the independent research team represented by Dr. Rosen and Karlsrud, which we facilitated for it to take place in Juba. These were done over 2 years, and I believe this is the outcome of their research that brought us here this morning. We held various project executive board meetings, and the project executive board is the body that actually oversees the operation of the project. It has representation from the state ministers of Ethiopia, the permanent secretary from Kenya, the permanent secretary from Uganda, and finally our minister as the chairman of the board. So through these project board meetings, we're able to address some of the challenges that we encounter as we run the project. Here we have the structure of the RSS IGAD initiative. The project board is actually the senior most body for the IGAD project. Underneath it, we have the officials that I mentioned representing them, as well as myself and my minister, and UNDP being the fund manager is also represented in the project board. Underneath it, we have a project assurance, which is led by the UNDP governance unit. And then the project management unit is based within our ministry and sees the day-to-day running of the project. So through project steering committee meetings that we normally have involving Norway as well as UNDP, were able to work before raising other issues to the quarterly project board. Below that, we have the participating ministries, and now underneath that, the 200 civil service support officers. So a number of achievements have been done under the project. Initially, I mentioned there was a lot of negative publicity to the project, and we felt that there's a need for us to go out and try to change the views that were there. And I'm happy to report that it has been changed 100%. The project board meetings are posted within the Government of Republic of South Sudan website. So it's open and available for everyone to see what are discussed, what are the issues. And it was able to convey to people that not a single melim, like we say in South Sudan, is spent from government funds to fund or pay the salaries of the civil service officers. This was a major concern for our civil servants because of austerity. There has been a freeze on recruitment. So whenever they see new people coming in, they feel that the government is spending money on them. So we literally had to explain that a donor funds it and fully shoulders all the payments. And this is something that that is really big, because when you look at the money that goes into the IGAD project, it's a huge amount. And we believe that it shows the commitment that the government of Norway has towards it. We publish articles in the local papers, which are widely read, and I believe it has helped create a positive impact with regards to the project. We also distributed brochures about the IGAD project to help create awareness. And then we have a quarterly newsletter within the ministry. It's called the Public Service Mirror, which covers, among other issues, the IGAD project. One permanent component that has come as a result of the RSS IGAD initiative is the construction of an office block from which the project is run. Previously, we had a prefab unit which was used as an office because we have a constraint of offices. But with the construction of the new offices, which was handed over officially to us last month, we have a permanent feature which is now almost proving that this IGAD project is here to stay for much longer than was initially envisioned. The RSS IGAD project has had quite a lot of achievements, but to mention a few, it has helped in building the capacity and creation of an enabling environment with improving the regulatory frameworks within some of the institutions. Key among them is the National Legislative Assembly. And then at the organizational level within ministries, it has helped in the training of the staff, in the implementation of some key schemes like the pension scheme. South Sudan at the moment still doesn't have an up and running pension fund. So we have a big problem of civil servants who are unable to retire because we are not able to pay them. But with the help of some of the civil service officers, we have been able to develop the bills which were passed successfully and which are now acts and are ready to help us set up the pension fund. It has helped in the improvement of basic administrative systems, and I can cite some things like the records management system, bookkeeping, accounting, which have helped in ensuring that we do things in a much more professional way. At the individual level, through coaching and mentoring, it has also helped in bringing in some good practices. One that is mentioned quite frequently is in the health sector. Issues to do with infection prevention practices in hospitals, as well as creating some training units within the hospitals to help our civil servants to improve how they do or how they carry out their duties. We have faced quite a lot of challenges under the IGAD project. However, we feel that those helped us to learn from the experience and move forward in how we can improve it further. Initially, lack of institutional, strategic, and work plans has also made it difficult for for the civil servants to be able to do their work properly. This is also compounded further by the absence of a comprehensive needs assessment. Often when I look at some of the requests that we got, it wasn't based on any scientific assessment that was done. It was more like a person would say, I need this person, but whether he really needs them for the 2 years is something that was questionable. So the absence of a comprehensive capacity needs and assessment prior to deployment was something that created a lot of problems. We plan to address that in phase 2 by doing a comprehensive needs assessment. My ministry has embarked on it, and we have completed it at the national level, at the central government level, and hope to move it to the state and county levels. Initially, strategic plans were absent, but institutions have managed to complete strategic plans, and this is with the support that we have from the Directorate of Management Services. Within the ministry, we were able to create this directorate as a result of the civil service support officers, and through their work, ministries have managed to have strategic plans which offered guidance for them to be able to do their work and plan better. There's a lack of human resource in the government. There's a high turnover also, where we have people moving in from the public sector to the private sector. And this has in a lot of ways set us back when we bring a civil servant, twin them with the civil service support officer, and then before you know it, they move on to work with some private bank or company, and the government is left without the necessary skills. However, we've tried to address it through the concept of group twinning, whereby rather than twin a civil service support officer to just one person, we try to twin them to a group of people, so that the transfer of knowledge is to a group of people and not just one individual. So if one person leaves, that can be easily replaced, and the knowledge continues with the other colleagues who are in the ministry. We are hoping that with the easing of austerity, we might be able to recruit more people who can in turn fill the gaps that have been noted and benefit from the RSS IGAD initiative. For phase 2, we have prepared a concept note whereby we felt we could also benefit from members of our diaspora. We have a huge diaspora even in the US here who have come back and are willing to serve within the country. So including them within the RSS IGAD program for phase 2 is something that has been considered. Norway has welcomed the idea, but suggested that we could look for funding through other institutions in view of some of the possible misunderstanding that might arise if they pick up on the issue of the diaspora. We have also tried to improve on the issue of ensuring that we have proper twins identified to work together with the civil service support officers by putting it as a precondition that 3 months prior to the civil service support officer coming in, there needs to be a twin identified who's already in place and working, so that by the time the civil service support officer comes on board, then it becomes a case of him being the one to welcome him, and then they start working together. So the idea of team twinning is something that we believe will help us carry it forward in phase 2. Another concern that I had not mentioned was the issue of security. Security is a major problem for the civil service support officers, and we are trying to ensure that although they are not given the same treatment as UN, at least the UNDP could come in and help them by ensuring that the places they live in are places which are reasonably safe, and then whenever they have problems, they can report to the Quick Response Security Office of the UNDP. Austerity measures and then the lack of operational budgets within the government have also impeded some of the work that could have been achieved, because as a result of that, some tools which are necessary for them to be able to carry their work have not been available. And it makes it very difficult for them to be able to work with the twins within government. We are hoping that by January, things could improve if the oil production resumes. And then CSSOs have even gone further by trying to establish partnerships with some of the NGOs that are working in the places where they're deployed. So through these partnerships, they're able to now carry forward the work that they're doing in an innovative manner. There's also a need for regular forums with participating institutions to help improve coordination. We plan on having biannual review workshops with the supervisors as well as the twins, so that at least there's better coordination and participation of those who are part and parcel of the process. Among some of the positive features of the IGAD project, which I feel I would need to highlight, sorry, you go on ahead. Yes. Among some of the positive features which I feel I need to highlight is that the IGAD countries who are participating come from the same background. So the issue of cultural affinity comes up as one key positive aspect, because it means that when they come in, being culturally the same, there's less need for them, or rather they adjust very quickly to the situation in South Sudan and are able to work together in the civil service. There's local ownership of the project. We take a very key interest in how the program and the life and the welfare of the civil service support officers, issues affecting them, are handled. And their countries are also actively involved in the day-to-day conduct of business in relation to their civil service officers. Flexibility, again, is one thing that has really helped us a lot. Because the program has been flexible in its approach, we're able to adjust as per the situation. Some of the civil, I can cite the example of a situation where a civil service support officer who was brought in felt that he had other skills he can contribute better in a different sector. And it was on the basis of that that he was transferred and moved to where his contributions could be more effective. So whenever there was a need to change, the program gave room for people to be able to adapt as per the needs there. The concept of group twinning, initially when the project was designed, was not there, but nowadays it seems to be the preferred mode of coaching and mentoring rather than individual one-on-one twinning. Gender balance is a big feature that we felt was well addressed under the project. Over 30% of the participants are women. So we felt that for us in South Sudan, that is something that we could look upon as an achievement. Again, this is a very cost-effective way of running the program, because when we tried to compare the type of the skills, because they are very highly skilled people from the civil service who come and work in South Sudan, and you compare it with hiring of consultants, it's more cost effective than it would normally cost to bring in a consultant on a short-term basis. So basically, this is just a brief on how we've been running the RSS IGAD project, and I hope you would find it useful and you might have some questions. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to start with thanking the IPI, NUPI, and the DIIS for inviting me here to share my experiences. In UNDP, we often say that capacity development is the overarching function that we deliver. And I also personally feel that capacity development is a critical element of international development, especially in the fragile and the conflict states. So I feel privileged to be here, to be sharing our experiences from Afghanistan on a day like this when policymakers, practitioners, researchers, they're all together. I'll be sharing with you our story on capacity development from Afghanistan. Basically, there are two themes that I'll touch. One is what we have been doing in Afghanistan, in general on capacity development, and in particularly in UNDP. And secondly, I'll move on to the models and the tools which are being discussed here today. And in both the cases, I'll try and talk of, according to me, what worked and what did not work. The capacity development landscape we start the story with the landscape of capacity development in Afghanistan. And whenever we talk of anything in Afghanistan, or those of you who may have read some documents, the first thing that the documents or anyone starts with is long years of conflict. So due to the long years of conflict, everything flows from there. What has happened there is the education system has collapsed over the last several decades. We were all listening to Ambassador Deng when he said that in South Sudan, the education system was good. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, the education system has collapsed because of the conflict. And that results into a very, very limited talent pool, which in turn results into very little private sector and weakened governance. And that, of course, leads to the capacity constraints on different levels within the government. I'd like to start with what is not, let's say, correct in terms of capacity development. Today, I would like to raise a lot of issues on what is working or what is not working. Of course, the views are my own, but the reason I'm sharing these issues because we would like to trigger discussion and debate on these issues. So in case of Afghanistan as a whole, what's not working in capacity development? Of course, the first thing is the very, very low buy-in from the stakeholders or from those whose capacities have to be developed. I do coaching and mentoring and training of government civil servants. And the hardest thing I face is getting them together to do sessions with them. They do not have the sense of urgency for capacity development. This is at the middle and lower level. At the senior management level, there are competing priorities. They have other problems to solve on a day-to-day basis. So coaching tends to be a little low on their priority. So the buy-in from the stakeholders. Then on the supply side, the capacity development initiatives have mostly been supply-driven. There are donor projects and the agenda is driven by their understanding of what needs to be done. And then in Afghanistan in the last decade, there has been a lot of aid and a lot of it has come for capacity development as well. However, there is very little or no coordination between the different CD practitioners or the different programs. And that has resulted into a lot of duplication, redundancy. At times, the same civil servant is sent for different training programs on the same topic by different donors, and things are taught differently, and we end up confusing him completely. So that element of coordination, although there has been a lot of aid, I guess, more than anywhere else in the world, but that has come with its own set of problems. Despite the fact that a lot of aid is said to be given for capacity development, in actual for focused capacity development or for focused models, let's say, there are not sufficient resources. I have worked in the CAP and the NIBP program, and we found it very tough to raise resources. Within UNDP, we have several programs, but there were other sector-specific programs like the subnational governance program where I work right now. The sector is very clear, so there are donors who have to work there, so the theme is clear to them, and it's not so hard to mobilize resources. But that problem is there in capacity development. Talking of the individual level capacities in Afghanistan, and in any post-conflict country, that generally is a constraint. There are low entry-level capacities in the government. Incentive structures are very weak. One point I would like to highlight here, which I feel may be unique to Afghanistan, because of weak capacities in the government civil services. We call the government civil services structure as Tashkil in Afghanistan and the staff as Tashkil staff. Because of the low capacities of the Tashkil staff, what's happened over the years, especially in the last decade, the government started hiring a lot of contractual staff through the donors, through the donor-driven programs. And what has happened over a period of time, these contractual staff are the ones who are running the program, who are running the government. But then they do not have the loyalty to the government. The moment a donor program offers them a few $100s more, they shift. So that sustainability part is not there. And the government structure is not strengthening its capacities in the process. So if we have to just pick up a few points as to why the capacity development efforts in Afghanistan, despite so much effort on it in the last decade, haven't worked. I would say one is, of course, the resources part of it. We need to walk the talk. So dedicated resources to capacity development, to innovative models such as coaching and mentoring, South-South cooperation. And then the lack of accountability mechanisms in the capacity development programs itself. Capacity development is not everybody's business, but what's happened is it's become fashionable that every program that is run in Afghanistan, there is a capacity development element. Whether or not it is addressing the CD issues is a different matter, but it's not everybody's business, but that's what's happening. When we talk of capacity development, there are different stages at which capacities exist in an organization. And the CD responses that have to be formulated should be aligned with the existing capacities. In Afghanistan, I say the government is at the level of obtaining capacity. So the CD tools or the CD models that have to be used should be catering to that. In another country, for example, I come from India. There we are at the stage of strengthening and maintaining capacity. So the tools used would be different. That sometimes is overlooked, has been overlooked in case of Afghanistan. These are some of the pictures from the two projects that I come from. Coming now to the main storyline and starting with the canvas for capacity development in Afghanistan. We have, as I said, we have different donor programs. In UNDP, we started with a program called Capacity for Afghan Public Services. That's where I worked in, and Frederick was there for the research on our project long back. At the same time, there was another, and this program was focusing on individual capacity development through coaching and mentoring. And it also had the South-South cooperation model built in through a MOU which was done between, a trilateral MOU between Government of India, Government of Afghanistan, and the UNDP. Simultaneously, there was another project, the Civil Services Leadership Program, which was focusing on training, and that too at the higher level, senior management level of government. So there were these two programs. In 2010, these two were merged, and UNDP decided that we should have an integrated and a focused approach to capacity development through one program. And as a result, the National Institution Building Program was formulated, for which the basic objective was to have a comprehensive approach to capacity development, not just individual or training, but the organization. Then we have some programs from USAID. World Bank has been supporting a lot of capacity development programs in Afghanistan. And the primary aim there has been capacity injection. So there were a series of programs in which the Afghan expats and qualified Afghans from within the country were recruited in order to inject capacity where it was missing in the government. Currently, there's a program called Capacity Building for Results Framework of World Bank, which is setting the direction of how the civil services structure will be supported through CD programs. And a lot of other international partners, including UNDP, are taking that as a base to design its programs in the future. Then we have a multilateral program called the Civilian Technical Assistance Program, through which specialized technical assistance is given to different ministries. Now, the UNDP programs the capacity development programs have been embedded in the Civil Service Commission, which, according to us, is the rightful partner for civil services reform or capacity development. However, there is a capacity problem within the Civil Service Commission, and as a result, some donors have started partnering with other government agencies. Like the World Bank is partnering with the Ministry of Finance, and so is the CTAP, which is the multilateral program. So in the government now in Afghanistan, there are 3 agencies which have the subject of capacity development as their mandate. One is the Civil Service Commission, of course, then the Ministry of Finance, and there is also a ICCD which was formed, which is the Interministerial Commission on Capacity Development, which was supposed to coordinate all the different CD programs. But that unit never got much support. So it's basically the MOF and IARCC. So the problems that have come is that there are different government agencies leading the subject. And again, the issue of coordination or the issue of putting the right focus on the design comes up. So that is what needs to be done. In my opinion, there needs to be a single capacity development facility led by a single government partner. And everyone pulls into that so that the design stays same and the resources can be pulled in. In the two programs, CAP and NIBP of UNDP, we followed the structured approach to capacity development, where we have a capacity assessment and followed by capacity development responses. As some of you may already be aware, UNDP has done a lot of background work in terms of developing the frameworks and methodologies for capacity development. And I don't say it because I'm from UNDP, but I have researched the other frameworks as well. The UNDP's framework is one of the best. It is most comprehensive and most structured. So in both CAP and NIBP, we followed that. This is the framework of NIBP, which is currently in place. The NIBP places capacity development advisors in a ministry, and that is based on a request given by the ministry and coordinated by the Civil Services Commission. So this is something similar to the IGAD initiative. Then the capacity development advisors, they conduct a capacity assessment. Now, and they do the capacity assessment based on the methodology. So there is a structured methodology. Out of the capacity assessment flows the CD responses, and a comprehensive capacity development plan is prepared for a ministry. And the plan has responses for different level, institutional level, what is the legal framework required for that ministry's subject area, what is the organizational restructuring required, the organizational level CD initiatives needed, and of course the individual. One thing that NIBP added in addition to the earlier CAP project was that it was not restricted just to coaching and mentoring, but also training, also advisory support, so that the ministry gets a comprehensive support. And the other additional feature of NIBP was twinning arrangements. Now, in our case, our twinning was slightly larger than what IGAD has done. So we were twinning, our plan was to twin ministries. So a ministry from Afghanistan and a ministry from India. So in CAP, we had a MOU between just Government of Afghanistan, represented by Civil Service Commission, Government of India, represented by its External Affairs Ministry, and UNDP. But in NIBP, we also started having, we had the parent MOU, and we started having the child MOUs between ministry to ministry under the overall framework. Now, this is, in my opinion, is a very good modality of providing twinning support, because then the whole of ministry's resources in the supporting government ministry can be utilized for capacity development. In both CAP and NIBP, we have been using, as I said, the structured methodology. But what we did was we simplified it. Now, the UNDP's methodology for capacity assessment or for CD plans, it's quite rigorous. However, when we implement that on the ground, a lot of effort and resources have to be put in just doing the capacity assessment. And in my opinion, the capacity assessment tool should be a means to an end and not an end in itself. Those of you who may have worked on or seen the UNDP's capacity assessment methodology, it's quite complex. It's detailed, but it's quite complex. So what we did in CAP and NIBP, we simplified and we adapted it. The methodology is for organizational capacity assessment, but we did it for individual civil servants also. In the CAP, we had coaches and coachees. So we did capacity assessment of coachees. We prepared baselines, and then every quarter we made targets and we saw what was the actual capacities end of the quarter, so as to measure if our coaching was making a difference or not. So what you have on the screen is what we collated for all the coaches of the CAP project. Then in NIBP, we developed a simpler version of the capacity assessment, because in NIBP we have to do the organizational capacity assessment. Now we have different parameters. I will not go into the technical details. When we do the UNDP's methodology by the book, there are a number of parameters on which you have to do the capacity assessment. You have to prepare a matrix. Then for the each intersection, you have to prepare a worksheet and a question sheet. So what we did was we reduced the number of parameters so that it is simplified, and also introduced some parameters which were specific to Afghanistan. For example, the issue of planning. Planning capacities are very weak in Afghanistan. This was missing in the UNDP's framework, so we introduced this. So basically, we Afghanized the tools, the capacity development tools. On the gender part, the only point that I want to highlight here is, in my opinion, the capacity development projects are more suited for bringing about gender responsiveness and gender mainstreaming than projects which are either only gender focused or other projects. I have adapted the BCG metrics to, let's say, evaluate the different projects, and I would place CAP and NIBP very high. We took two parameters. One is the outreach in the government, and then doing the actual gender-based activities. So the projects which are just gender-focused, they're very high on gender-based activities, but their outreach may not be very high. And similarly, there are other projects whose outreach may be high, but their gender component is not so high. So projects designed like CAP or NIBP, where different advisors are placed in the ministries and they carry out the gender agenda. We used to prepare gender action plans which had the different gender-based activities, and they were delivered through the CAP advisors. So such projects are well suited for delivering the gender responsiveness as well. Coming to the features that worked, I will be talking about some of them more in the second part of my presentation shortly. The only two things that I want to talk about here is, in both CAP and NIBP, we use the 24/7 model in the sense that the advisors sit in the government ministry and they work with them. I think the IGAD project also works like that, but a lot of programs in UNDP work on a different modality, that we have a project, it is housed in the, let's say, common facilities of UNDP, and people go and interact with the government on a need basis. What really works for capacity development is this 24/7 model. You have to be working close to your counterparts to be able to develop capacity on a continuous basis. And then the qualities of a capacity development practitioner, what works in Afghanistan, the practitioners who have succeeded. One, of course, is the domain knowledge or the subject area. In NIBP program, in CAP program, we used to hire coaches or advisors who had speciality in common functions of governance, like basic financial management, procurement, policy making, human resource management. So just the basic functions which are needed for government to function successfully. But in NIBP, we moved one step further and we started getting sector-specific specialists, and they worked as CD advisors. So you have to have the domain knowledge to be able to be successful as a CD practitioner. Then it is very important to have characters such as patience and interpersonal skills. In Afghanistan, when I'm coaching people or when I'm training people, sometimes I have to repeat the same thing 10 times in the same session and then 3 times more in subsequent sessions. So you have to be patient. There is no alternative to that. A lot of time people get frustrated. This guy is not understanding. But that's the whole point. We need to do capacity development, especially in places where the entry-level capacities are very low. And of course, the interpersonal skills. In CAP, we had to coach people. So we had to have, let's say, each coach would have 5 or 10 coaches. But people did not like being called coaches. I think this was said elsewhere also. So, and especially at the middle and the senior management level. So we had to be very careful. We would not call them coach, and I do that still with my counterparts who are at senior level. I don't tell them that I'm coaching you, but I keep giving them, keep transferring the skills. So the interpersonal skills part is very important too. This, of course, moral of the story for capacity development in Afghanistan. We need to use the right model, the right tools, the capacity development responses. Now, these are relevant for a hardcore capacity development practitioner. When we make a capacity development plan, how relevant your responses are or your CD initiatives are. That is very important. Otherwise, the capacity development plan may just stay as a piece of paper. Coming now to the final part of my presentation, where I said I'll share my views on models and tools, which we are likely to discuss in more detail over here. And I'd like to give a critique on some of these issues. Now, the South-South model. Prior to coming for this conference, I have read a number of papers which Friedrich and others have written, and they've shared with me. And I saw that there was this debate being generated, whether South-South model has all the benefits, whether it does have solutions to all the problems. There could be problems in the South-South model itself. However, my view is that yes, there are issues that need to be addressed, but the model per se is good. And the reasons are obvious, they have been discussed before, the cultural affinity part of it. Why the cultural affinity part works is, it's easier for a person from similar cultural background to start talking to the government partners. The trust part comes easily. But it's not just restricted to the cultural affinity part of it. Even contextually or technically, it makes more sense. For example, in our NIBP program, we have placed an advisor in the Ministry of Agriculture in Afghanistan, and he was earlier working as a civil servant in Ministry of Agriculture in India. Now, he has supported the Ministry of Agriculture in Afghanistan in preparing a saffron policy. Now, saffron is relevant to both Afghanistan and India. In India, it is grown in Jammu and Kashmir, which is an insurgency-infected place. Similarly, in Afghanistan, saffron is being advocated as an alternate to opium. So there are those similarities. And because this civil servant had experience on saffron policy back home, he was able to work here. Similarly, through the twinning arrangements with the ministry back home, he has sent several people for training in saffron growing and saffron management to India. So the South-South model definitely has a lot of merits. I would like to qualify, however, that we should not pit South-South against South-North or North-North. What's important here is the cooperation part of it. The model may be South-South or South-North. That depends on the post-conflict or the fragile country, its context, its geographical location, and its historical relations with the country which is providing the support. So a South-North model may work very well if there have been historical relationships and there have been an exchange of technical expertise there. So the important part here is cooperation. And when we do it through a twinning arrangement, through a formal cooperation model or through a formal MOU, then the buy-in or the commitment from the sourcing country, from where the CD advisors come, is higher. For example, this, again coming back to this Ministry of Agriculture person, on his own, he can only give this much support to the Ministry of Agriculture in Afghanistan. But when there is a ministry behind him, the resources of the ministry can be used, and the canvas of capacity development support is much larger. So it's the cooperation part of the model which is important. And organizational twinning, I feel, is more important than individual level twinning because of obvious benefits. There is the issue of programmatic versus operational analysis. There are operational problems that have been faced in different South-South model programs. I'll come to that in the next slide. But we should not let the operational constraints comment on the programmatic strength of the model. The next part is practitioners. In CAP or in NIBP, we had civil servants coming from Government of India and working in Afghanistan. So when you are a practitioner, you know hands-on how to solve problem. What are the issues? Even simple thing as how hierarchy in the government functions. There is a way in which hierarchy in the government works in India and in that part of the world. And there is a way in which it works in the developed world. So just those smaller nuances, and of course the technical expertise which comes from the practitioners. A lot of times in international development, what happens is we hire technical experts who may be very good at the theory of what they're doing, but it's the practical which is missing. So the practitioner element of capacity development should be highlighted a lot. Coming to the capacity development toolkit. For capacity development, we say we use different tools. There's coaching and mentoring, there is training, there is technical advice, then we have conferences, seminars. All of them result into developing capacities. But again, we need to be careful as to which tool to use. So coaching and mentoring, where entry-level capacities are low, is very important. Other issue which I read when I was reading papers on the IGAD initiative, and this is relevant for CAP and NIBP also, the training of the experts, the coaches or the CD advisors, they may be expert in their areas, whether it is Ministry of Health or Ministry of Agriculture, they know their job. But how to do capacity development, that part of training and orientation is very important, which is there in the design, but sometimes we miss on in practical. And then the measurement and monitoring. The monitoring of what's happening on the ground is very, very important. Finally, this is a point that is my personal opinion, that whenever we have technical advisors coming in for any program, there should be an inbuilt component in their TOR of transfer of skills or coaching. And this is my final slide, where I want to touch on the problematic areas or the sticky areas which are there in the current plot on capacity development via these innovative models. The first is the role of project management. Now, this is a very obvious thing, but a lot of times we go wrong because of problems that happen in project management. In case of CAP and NIBP, when we formulated CAP, consciously the project manager and the project management team was a mix of people who were practitioner civil servants and project management experts. The same happened in the NIBP in the initial years. But due to some internal shifting of priorities in the organization, the project management team changed. And as a result, most of the critical elements of the project suffered, whether it was recruitment of advisors, if the right advisors were recruited or not, then what their orientation on how to deliver capacity development, that part started missing, and the monitoring part. So because of the project management, even though the design was good, this suffered into, yes, I'm just winding up, yes.
20 minutes was the allocated time for each speaker.
Sure,
and you're
sure.
way past that, so we need to allow questions.
I'm just winding up. Okay, so I'll not touch on the other ones, the advisors, what to do. I just want to end with this question, which I read in an article, default versus design, whether we should focus on the design or whether we should let it go by default. And sometimes by default, we come up with good results. I would like to say that we should stick to the design. It is the implementation of the design that we really need to concentrate on. And what we should have is design with flexibility. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've had two very rich presentations, one on South Sudan, the other on Afghanistan. And the intention now is to throw the discussion open to see how these two particular case studies provide lessons which can be drawn to be replicated elsewhere. What are the other issues? And I think some of the questions which are already listed based on both the presentations, I think we should try and focus on those in the interaction, and the floor is open. Yes, sir. Mr. Marshall, if my... Yeah.
David Marshall from the Human Rights Office at the UN. Thank you very much for both those presentations. With regard to South Sudan, I was there in 2011 and 12 and was really intrigued by the IGAD initiative. On recruitment, my understanding was that the TORs were developed jointly, the interviews were done jointly, and the selection was done jointly. Is that correct? Secondly, on the salary issue, was that an issue in South Sudan with the local staff member? My understanding was that the IGAD staff member retains his or her benefits, his or her salary from their home country. And did that raise any issues? Thirdly, the issues of language. I understand that there was an issue with Ethiopians coming to South Sudan. There was a language issue there in Juba and beyond. And then finally, Juba is incredibly expensive, even for UN bureaucrats. How was that alleviated with regard to this initiative? Thank you.
May I suggest that we take a few more questions so that our speakers can have a chance to focus on them when they speak. So I'd be happy to take a few more questions. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the question of getting? Could you talk a little bit more about the question of getting high quality people to be involved in this program? Since one of the things we often find is that the folks who are interested in going out of town extensively are people who have particular reasons for doing so.
Mr. Scott?
Thanks. Matthew Scott with World Vision. I noticed one challenge was around the lack of understanding of local context, and that even with the regional affinity is still a challenge. I'd be interested to know what are some of the approaches that are helping address that deficit.
Maybe let's take one more and then we'll request the speakers to respond.
Thank you. My question actually builds upon that, and I'm just wondering, first of all, fantastic presentations, and just a little background. I mean, at one point in my life, I was worked in an UNMIL as a civil affairs officer, and I think it was assumed that we were supposed to be doing a lot of capacity development and had absolutely no idea what that actually meant and the precise methods that we should be using to actually do that. So I'm thrilled that there's a lot more emphasis on this, but I still think we have a long way to go in terms of really getting down to the nitty-gritty of the methods that worked. And you talked a little bit, both of you, about the kind of the trickiness at times of working, of more senior officials not wanting to be seen as having mentors and so forth. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about the psychological components of capacity development and what we're learning about that in different contexts, but also what about different sectors? Are there different methods emerging that seem, or lessons around methods for different sectors? And in particular in the area of peace building, are there any approaches to conflict sensitivity and learning about the conflict drivers and how that might feed in also to methods of capacity development, as well as sort of epistemological and ideological approaches to particular subjects and types of work that different actors might bring within different contexts, how that might influence. So thank you.
Thank you very much. May I request the two speakers to take them first from the South Sudan listing and then Afghanistan. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much. In response to the first question on whether the TORs were developed jointly, yes, initially within South Sudan, the TORs were developed jointly for all the civil service support officers, that is between our ministry and the ministry that is requesting a civil service support officer and the country that is providing them. However, there was one exception, and that was in the case of Ethiopia. We were not directly involved in the recruitment process, and that did create a bit of a problem later on because issues linked to grading, years of experience also arose, as well as the issue of language. But in the case of Kenya and Uganda, we were involved with the Public Service Commission there in developing the terms of reference as well as conducting the interview and the selection of the civil service support officers. The issue of salaries, when the civil service support officers were brought into South Sudan, their salaries continued back in their home countries. What is given to them through the NORAD funded project is a consolidated allowance which would help cover for their expenses in Juba. You did mention that Juba is very expensive, and on average, the civil service support officers are paid enough to sustain them for their stay in Juba. However, there's been a lot of concern raised by the civil service support officers that what they're paid is not sufficient, and it's under review now by the project board to see how to increase it to a level where it would be reasonable. In some cases, for some of the civil service support officers who were deployed in the States, they were luckier because some of the institutions even provided accommodation for them. So it became a case of just catering for some of their basic needs like feeding and so on, while accommodation was taken care of. The case of Juba, true, is a problem because we've had instances where in order for them to be able to save something, they ended up renting places in neighborhoods which were not exactly safe for them. And there were some instances of them being subjected to some thefts and so on. But at least that is being addressed because where they're staying now is being reviewed first by the UN before they can rent a place or decide on where to stay. The issue of language is a problem, and it was noted initially that the group, especially from Ethiopia, were the ones who had a problem communicating or understanding the other people, because in the South, predominantly English is the language, but also Arabic is very commonly used. For the Kenyan and Ugandan nationals, they were able to adapt a lot easily because English was the medium of communication, and then it was a case of relying on their twins or others to now translate, especially in cases of health professionals and so on. But for the Ethiopians, since English was not often the medium of communication, there were difficulties there. And it was noted that it would be brought to the attention of the recruiting body in Ethiopia to make sure that the seconded civil servants are conversant in English. There was a question on lack of understanding about the local context. The thing in South Sudan is we tried through the orientation program, starting with the induction as well as orientation, to make sure that they understand what they're getting into. So through the orientation, we try as much as possible to make them understand what South Sudan is all about in terms of the kinds of practices that are in existence, the laws and so on. But the fact that we come from the same region and a lot of people have been moving across the border in one country or the other makes it a lot easier for them to adapt because they are already familiar. It's just a case of them moving now to work in South Sudan. But there's a lot of similarity in how they're living and how we live in South Sudan. It's true that some of our senior officials were initially resistant to the idea of being coached or mentored by another person. However, we tried as much to stress on the part of the benefit of the training because the request would often come from the ministry concerned. So usually their supervisor, who is a more senior person, is the one who would bring in the civil service support officer. And then when we moved forward, people try as much as possible not to use the concept of coaching or mentoring, but rather twinning, which means they're equal, and it's easier for transfer and acceptance on the part of the South Sudanese civil servants. I think I passed.
I'll respond first to a question related to high quality people. That is a very, very pertinent question, and this actually happens. I have experience from Government of India. When people get posted to far-flung areas where they don't want to go, they try to apply for such programs, and there were people like that who came. How we tried to address that is in the project management team, we also had civil servants or practitioners who knew exactly who is working where and what may be the causes, and we used to do a lot of background checks as well, so before shortlisting people. But this is an issue, and in fact, the last slide that I had, which I could not speak on, I was suggesting this, that there needs to be a lot of dialogue between the two governments before the project starts, so that that awareness in the sourcing government is there, that they are careful in who they send. Then the question of orientation on question of understanding the local context. Yes, one is the orientation part, and we try to prefer people who have who may already have some experience in Afghanistan or in a conflict country. And my response to that also is people who have some cultural affinity, because the question was, despite the cultural affinity, the local context may not be understood. Those who have that affinity, they are quicker to learn and adapt. That is what we have experienced too. I would, and the psychological content, yes, that is very important. And as I also mentioned in my presentation, the capacity development advisor or the coaches who succeeded were the ones who were able to get the psychological part correct. You have to deal with different management levels in Afghanistan government differently. So like I said, that you're talking to a deputy minister or a director general, but you don't tell him that you are coaching him. At the same time, you are doing that at a subconscious level. So the psychological part is very important, and only those who do it right succeed. Finally, there was an issue on the payment terms. I would like to comment in contradiction to what was asked, that do the locals have a problem that the CSSOs were getting salaries back in their home. In our case, in CAP and NIBP, people were not getting salaries back home, but they were getting a salary equivalent to what they would get back home, plus some allowances for hardship. What actually happened was that salary was much less than what the other international staff in UNDP were getting. And these people were working in harsher conditions, sitting in the government ministry. In Afghanistan, it's not secure. And otherwise also it is challenging. So it was actually the demoralizing part which was having an impact on people. And the moment they would join, they would come there happy. But when they would start comparing, they would start applying for other positions. And some of them moved on as well. So that is one of the points I wanted to also raise in the last slide of my presentation, that this is something which needs to be addressed when we are designing next programs.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor to another set of questions, having the privilege of moderating this session, one of the points which strikes me is that when you're looking at the situation in South Sudan and Afghanistan, there are some fundamental differences. One is a newborn country. I had the privilege of visiting it immediately after the referendum in July 2011, Francis? Is that 9th July?
No, independence.
Yes, independence, yeah. That was the independence and the referendum just before that. And I recall when I went there, and I say this in response to the question about living conditions, salary, living conditions, and a host of related issues. There was a total of 5 kilometers of motorable roads in the country at that point of time, as I remember it. There was just not the infrastructure which is basically required. There was a lot of international goodwill. The international community really wanted to reach out and provide development assistance. But in order to be able to receive development assistance, you need to be able to have the minimum infrastructure in order to be able to utilize it and channelize it. And therefore, you needed a lot of voluntary workers, etc. And if you look back, and then you can build a country if you have conditions of relative peace and stability. If you are still having an ongoing problem with your erstwhile partners, and that, there was a reference to resumption of the oil supplies, etc. So that's a sui generis condition. And I would say that in that condition, in that situation, the approach in terms of development cooperation is, let's get the best we can and get on with it. Time will then resolve some of the other issues, and you can't compare the situation in Juba for a variety of reasons than in other countries. In the case of Afghanistan, I suspect, but I don't know very much about it, you have a situation where this has been going on for a while. Again, multiplicity of agencies and donors wanting to provide development assistance. There is this fundamental discrepancy that if the same individual were to come in, let's say through an Indian ITEC program, he would be paid his basic Indian salary. And if the same individual were to come in through a UNDP program, he would be paid 10 times the salary. Now, the quality, etc., again, I think there is, in each of these situations, whether you're dealing with DRC or any of the other situations, that it requires a particular kind of missionary with a lot of desire to do good, and the rest follows. But those were just comments I couldn't resist making. We still have a little time for question and answers. And if you don't mind, Francesco, we can even eat a little into the coffee break. Yeah, please. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank both of the presenters for excellent presentations. I'm with UN Peacekeeping, DPKO Rule of Law, and it's certainly true, and my police colleague may speak to this, but in the police and the corrections areas, we draw vastly from the Global South, and I think that is an excellent part of the approach. At the same time, listening to the presentations, there are many elements that are missing. Some of the tools that you've mentioned, we don't have in the toolbox. One is training, primarily the training for seconded staff. The burden on that is on member states to do it, though we developed some training methodologies. The second, good point about project management experience. We most of the time don't have people that have that experience, nor even experience in an international context as a trainer or advisor, and I will not use the word mentor or coach. Furthermore, flexible modalities. We really have rather limited approaches for deploying people, and I think the CivCap team may be working more on adding flexibility to that toolbox. Gender balance. We are working on that, and I think we have achieved about a 20% percentage of women in our seconded corrections officers, but that's not enough. We didn't match your 30% that was mentioned. Project funding. We're still handicapped by primarily a lack of project funding, and as the ambassador pointed out, you need to be able to do something in the infrastructure area as well, and not just the advice and training. And then we are also beholden to the quality of people that are offered by member states. A lot of times member states don't give their best and brightest. They want to keep the best and brightest at home, working hard where they're needed, and it might be those who are floating a little bit that are easier to release from government service. So we need that inspired person who wants to do it out of the goodness of their heart. That also is the top quality. So my question would be, based on all of that, could you give a little bit more about how these projects address those same challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take maybe two more questions? Yes, sir.
Charles Briefel from DPK. Just one follow-up question. We've heard that the IGAD project really focuses on certain ministries, the Ministry of Health, for example. Has there been consideration of expanding the IGAD project to rule of law sectors in terms of providing expertise, mentoring in the prosecutors' offices, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I was interested in the cultural affinity aspect beyond culturally fitting in, being from the same region, but thinking specifically in the context of how the civil services operate or the specific ministries operate. I mean, one would assume that there's some degree of near similar context in how these ministries operate, and that therefore there are coping mechanisms and solutions that the twins would come up with, maybe interesting and useful for the recipients. And I was wondering if you could point to any particular, or have you picked up any particular examples of individual or institutional behavior that has changed as a result of this intervention, that came up with solutions that was interestingly different than perhaps the normal kind of solutions that would have come from a more north-south exchange of experiences. And to Dahir, I was very interested in your last comment about the default versus design issue, and what I'm interested in is to know is in what context was that an issue for you? How did that arise, and why do you feel that was an issue in terms of your experience?
Would you like to start, and then
Thank you very much. I think to start with some of the issues that were mentioned, one thing I want to mention is that because of the ownership that was taken, or rather the ownership that exists among the member nations to the IGAD initiative, it was a lot easier for us to be able to get quality civil servants who are willing to come and serve in the country. So basically, as a result of that, the countries sent their best people, because it was a case of national pride and helping their younger brother South Sudan to come up to the same level as they are. So most of the people that we had were civil servants who were credible in their own countries, and also the fact that they were people who had worked for a long time, maybe for very little salaries. They looked upon the package that is given under the IGAD program as an incentive initially, though some were disappointed later when you compare that Juba is as expensive as New York and the money was not sufficient for them to be able to manage on it. But initially that was a driver because this was a program which would give them international experience and might even open doors for them to be able to seek employment further in the future at the end of the project. So some of the qualities came naturally under the IGAD project because the countries were committed to supporting the program and giving us the best that could be sent to South Sudan. With regards to health, I mentioned health was the sector that got the most. There's a great need there, but also the fact that the head of health by then bought into the idea and was able to put in their requests. In phase 2, what we're trying to do is look at the priority sectors that are identified by the government and select civil service support officers as per which sectors the government feel are necessary for us to be able to move forward quickly and improve the capacity. The context of cultural affinity. When I look at South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda, one similarity that you can get among the first three, minus Ethiopia, is that these are former British colonies. The services are similar in a lot of ways. When you look at the civil service in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and now in South Sudan, there's lots of similarities in addition to the cultural aspects. Maybe Ethiopia would be an exception to that. But these factors all, I believe, contributed to the fact that the basis for the formation of government were the same. Linked to it also the issue of culture, which are basically the same, except that we have different borders dividing us. But these are imaginary borders in a lot of ways, because you find the same tribes across the border when you move between Ethiopia, Uganda, between South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Uganda. Some of the institutional behaviors that we feel have changed and might be linked to the way the services are run in the other countries. One I can cite is issue of time management. In South Sudan, there was this tendency of not respecting the right time to come for work and the right time to leave. However, when the civil service support officers came in, they would report to work on time. And then when they leave, it's usually at the end of the day. And the twin will think twice before leaving because he's seeing something new that is being brought. And I believe that has helped in improving how they perform because they're able to dedicate more time to work and bring about a cultural change in the aspect of time and being dedicated to their work.
I'll address the question on default versus design as to how I came to that. Of course, the thought process triggered when I was reading the article by Friedrich on default versus design, where the case study from IGAD was used, and it was mentioned that in the initial, let's say, period, there was no clarity on where to place people, what they were supposed to do, so the guidelines for them were not clear. Nonetheless, they did work out mechanisms like she mentioned group twinning, and there were successes. There were a lot of successes. So the article says that by default the successes came. Now, my experience from CAP and NIBP, and as I mentioned that there were periods of project management problem in NIBP, because of which the success is reduced. Nevertheless, even at that time, by default, those CD advisors who had good capacities, who understood what they had to do, they were doing, and they did more. But my point is that when things are done by design, then the results are more effective and they are larger spread. Because in times of default, those whose capacities are not there of the deliverers or their motivation is not there, they will end up delivering nothing, and the project as a whole suffers. So that this default versus design part. And what we need to infuse is the flexibility element. For example, in our CAP project, we started only with coaching and mentoring. That was the mandate of the advisors. But then they realized that if they had to work in the ministry, they had to have a buy-in from the senior management of the government, and they only needed advisory support. They didn't care about coaching. So they started advising also. So with flexibility, this came. But then we institutionalized it in the next phase of the program. So it was not by default. So the point I'm making is it should be by design and let's say with flexibility.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy that we've had a fairly extensive exchange, and we're doing very well on time. And before we conclude, and I request you all to give both our speakers a very strong expression of our appreciation, let me just say that, again, one parting thought. I think South Sudan has a lot of challenges, developmental challenges, but they have the time, and I think the goodwill of the international community to overcome those challenges, and I'm sure with all those agencies operating there, that task will be accomplished to the full satisfaction of the aspiration of the people of South Sudan. Insofar as Afghanistan is concerned, I think we've got some testing times ahead. I think the 2014, post-2014 situation and the fact that considerable resources have been expended for the last several years, questions that are going to be asked, how much of this effort which the international community has undertaken, and some parts of the international community more than the other, to what extent is that effort, has it been sustainable? And will the institutions, and that capacity building is about institutions. It's not about individuals. I think, Madam, you made a very good point that if you twin to individuals, and there is a de-twinning, if I may say so, if that's the correct word, you tend to lose it. But when you twin with 5, but I think what we want to say is that you twin with institutions, because then the institution imbibes the transfer of knowledge, know-how, and technology, and that lives on. It's like that famous example, you get fish and give it to someone, that is one thing, but if you teach them fishing, that's an institutional capacity that you build. But I think it's very useful to have these discussions, and I think the civilian capacity issue is going to be looked at now again, capacity building issue in the next session. I was waiting to see if my friend Zahir Tanin is here. If not, can I request you to give both our speakers a strong appreciation of the excellent presentations made, and then we can adjourn for coffee.